Theatre and have a seat, please. Thank you, Charlie. That was really nice. So we have lots of familiar faces today. Most of you I know from my former role. I was the Director of Environmental Studies. Now I'm the Dean of the Business School. My name is Susan Gilberts. Welcome to campus. I welcome you also on behalf of our Chancellor, Stephanie Hickswa. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the original peoples of the spaces that we occupy this evening. Here at MSUB, we acknowledge and honor with respect the indigenous nations on whose traditional homelands Montana State University Billings now stands, and whose historical and cultural relationships with the land continue to this day. Many indigenous peoples thrive in this place, alive and strong. This evening, we endeavor to fulfill one of the most important purposes of university life. We will engage in the open and respectful exchange of ideas, opinions, and information. Our forum tonight, Petro Hall, provides us the opportunity to listen attentively and to engage in constructive dialogue. MSU Billings willingly partners with local groups to support public discussions across a wide range of topics. Let us know if your group hopes to stimulate thoughtful conversation about topics that are important to our community. Tonight's event is hosted by 3 campus entities. We're supported by MSUB Center for Engagement, MSUB College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, and MSUB College of Business. I welcome everyone to our campus. We're delighted to have all of you here. May goodwill and good humor prevail. And now I turn the proceedings over to Tom Tao.
Thank you, Susan. And I want to ask if our speaker, Bill McKibben, and the person who introduces him, Steve Running, will come on up and sit down here while, so they're ready to go. But before they come, I want to tell you that this is the main program, but it's one of many programs that we have scheduled for this week. This is Climate Week 2024. And that came about because we had a week last year that went over quite well. Steve Running was our principal speaker at that time, and we thought it went over so well we ought to do it again, and that's what we have done. So I want to tell you first of all that you should pick up one of these if you don't have it, because this is the schedule for the whole week. And it's not just this program tonight, although we think this is the main one. We also have a program tomorrow night that will be 3 very impressive speakers who will work on the question of what is going to happen in terms of climate change to the people of Montana. I think a really important question, and Steve Running is going to be on that program. Bruce Matthews, professor at MSU, and also Robert Byron is going to speak on that. 3 good people. And that's at the Billings Public Library, 6 o'clock. The Tuesday, maybe even more important, is where MEIC has organized a program on people who will be talking about the transmission lines. If we're going to have clean energy, we've got to figure out a way to get it to the people who need the energy. And the transmission lines is a part of it, but they really aren't very sufficient right now and very organized. So that's really important. We're going to have a program on Wednesday night. Oh, by the way, that program is at 5 o'clock, and it is at the, let's see, that is beyond, no, wait, I get it right. It's at Sacred Grounds on 2950 King Avenue. That's the one on transmission lines. Then on Wednesday night at the First Congregational Church, just downtown, we're going to have a program on storytelling. Some very impressive people will be involved in that, so I urge you to look into that. Thursday night, we have a film at Art House, free for anybody that wants to come and see it. A documentary on plastics. And if you don't know what that's all about, we need to learn that, because that is really significant, a problem that we need to face. So, and there are a number of others. Look at the schedule and you can see. I think that's really impressive. But I want to tell you one other thing, and that is that the people the organizations that have worked on this program are numerous. And we're delighted to have them, including the two that were referred to just recently by Susan, the Business College and the College of Liberal Arts and what's the rest of that? And it's, I don't have my notes with me. At any rate, and other items those two people are actually sponsoring this program today. In addition to that, we have a lot of sponsors, and you can see them on our schedule. And for instance, Forward Montana, Western Native Voice, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Billings Association of Humanists, This House of Books, Sustain Billings, MEIC, and the Yellowstone Valley Citizens Council, and the Billings Citizens Climate Lobby, the League of Women Voters, Voter Climate Action, the Families for a Livable Climate and Sustainable Billings, again. Beyond Plastics is also helping with the film. The Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, and Billings TrailNet, and Billings Association of Humanists. We have a lot of sponsors, and that's impressive that we got that many people together for this week. So I'm really delighted. Now, the main reason I'm here, however, is to tell you that the person who's going to introduce the speaker tonight is Professor Steve Running. He was our main speaker last year, and he's now has the opportunity to introduce the new speaker, main speaker this year. Let me tell you that Steve Running has degrees from Oregon State University. He's been at the University of Montana since 1979. He is officially the University Regent Professor Emeritus of Global Ecology. He has worked with the NASA Earth Observing System, and he has published some 300 scientific articles and 2 books. And maybe most importantly, he was the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which prepared a report that received one of the 2 persons receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. So we're delighted to have him here to start us out today.
See, I figure when I'm not the main speaker, I don't have to wear long pants. It's a difficult task to introduce somebody of the caliber of Bill McKibben. His official title is Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. But, you know, that's really only the beginning. He's been a contributing writer for the New Yorker for a long time. He co-founded 350.org, which I think most of us know well. I think rather than going through all his honorary degrees and things like that, I want to give you a little context that I can relate to, that I think tells you something about Bill's career. The public, let's call it the public announcement of global warming, began in 1988 when Jim Hansen testified in front of Al Gore's committee in Congress. And he testified explicitly that global warming had begun. Now, I was a NASA-funded Earth scientist at that time, and we all thought, are you kidding me? We knew it's on the way, but we thought Jim had really jumped the gun, that he was really getting the cart ahead of the horse, that there really wasn't evidence yet clear enough to make a pronouncement like that in a forum like that. Well, of course, turned out Jim was right. It didn't take too many years looking then backwards and saying, yeah, it was. Well, Bill McKibben wrote his first book in 1989. And so Bill, from the very beginning of the public perception of global warming, has not only been a contributor, but really a lead writer and in climate change science. And I'd have to say, we scientists were so relieved to have authors like Bill McKibben doing the main writing, because we were still trying to just do the science and get the numbers right. Bill's, I think I'm correct, you have 18 books? You've lost count, haven't you? I thought writing 2 books wasn't bad. It's just remarkable how, from the very beginning, from 1989 to the present, Bill has every couple of years had a new book out that distills what had been learned, what the new issues were. So he's been in this absolutely from the very beginning. And so it really is, I hope you recognize, we're really quite honored to have Bill here with us tonight. Bill.
Well, thank you both enormously for those kind words, but also for all your long, long, long hard work. And thank you all. It's a real pleasure to be here. I confess I was kind of worn out by the time I landed in Billings today. And I've been on the road for quite a while, and I'll be on the road sort of nonstop through November 5th, out at all the swing states trying to do what we can. I was a little worn out, but tonight already has just revived me. That beautiful music somehow was really important, and to have a little food and just get to meet people and things. This is a good place, and I'm really glad to get to be here. Probably more fun for me than for you. I mean, really my career for 35 years has been as a professional bummer-outer of people, you know. And so there will be a little bit of that. We will do that for a minute, but we'll try and end, and I think honestly, in a more not in a hopeful place. I don't spend my life I don't feel any obligation to provide you with a dose of hope. Reality is sufficient. But suffice it to say that I would not be bothering to be here if I had succumbed to some kind of terminal despair. Let's begin with the hard part. Since this is the beginning of Climate Week, let's set the stage as closely as we can as to where we are right now in 2024. Because Steve's right, in 1988 or 1989, we were offering a series of warnings about what was going to happen if we didn't stop burning coal and gas and oil, because that's always been the root cause of the trouble that we're in. And it has been difficult to watch those warnings come true over time. The last thing that I wanted to do was be proved right about where we were, because we've done very little until very recently to reduce in any way the amount of fossil fuel we've been burning. All that CO2 and methane has been piling up in the atmosphere. In fact, humans have produced more carbon dioxide in the years since 1988 than in all of human history before 1988. So these warnings were not spectacularly effective, it must be said. Because of that accumulation of those gases in the atmosphere, we're now seeing precisely what scientists told us would happen. It's actually happening a little bit faster, I would say, by the order of several decades than we would have guessed in the 1980s. The Earth turned out to be somewhat more finely balanced than we'd perhaps quite understood. Remember, this is the first time we've conducted this experiment with any of us around to watch, and so it stands to reason that we wouldn't be able to figure out precisely what was going to happen. And it's also worth remembering that scientists almost always err on the side of conservatism, underestimating where we would be. That's, at this point, almost impossible to underestimate because the damage is so clear and large. Beginning about January of last year, January of 2023, I started getting a lot of phone calls from oceanographer friends of mine who were saying something weird is happening with the temperature of the oceans. It's been going steadily up. 93% or so of the heat that we've produced thanks to the greenhouse effect has been absorbed in the oceans. If the oceans weren't there moderating that temperature, we would have run the average temperature of the planet up to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit already. But the oceans, beginning in about January of last year, began to spike their temperature quite dramatically. By June of last year, buoys off the Florida coast were registering the highest temperatures we've ever recorded in the oceans, about 101 degrees off the Keys, which is the temperature you set your hot tub at, okay? And that next month, in June of last year, since we now have an array of satellites and thermometers and stuff around the world, we can calculate every day the average temperature of the planet. And the temperature is always highest in the course of the year in the weeks around the solstice in the northern hemisphere. There's more land mass in the northern hemisphere, so this is the period on the planet when we get the hottest days of the year. And the hot days in June and July of 2023, scientists were saying, were the hottest days that we had ever recorded on this planet. Now, those records go back a couple of hundred years, because that's how long we've had thermometers, but lots of branches of the scientific profession are good at figuring out proxy records that can take us much further back. Tree rings, lake sediments, on and on and on. And they were saying with complete confidence by last June that we were seeing the hottest days we've seen on this earth in at least the last 125,000 years. That heat has continued. Every month since June of last year has been the hottest has broken the record for the month. We've had 15 straight record hot months on this planet. And so the days around the solstice this year broke the record in 2023. You've lived through the hottest, you live on the hottest planet that really anybody's ever lived on. Because 125,000 years takes us, I mean, that's the moment at which archaeologists say humans first began to sort of etch symbols on bone and things. We're really back to the beginning of our civilization, our species as a recognizable form. That heat now is observable and doing extraordinary damage in all kinds of ways. At the sort of grossest, largest scale, both poles are now melting quickly. The latest data this year from what's happening in the Antarctic is particularly disturbing because the great glaciers are clearly being undercut by warm seawater faster than people had expected, and the sort of week-by-week accounts are getting more frightening all the time. The other big physical systems of the world are showing the same kinds of flux. The Amazon, which has warmed dramatically, is drying out, turning from less of a rainforest and at least at its edges into more of a savanna, and now prone to fire. The great boreal forests of the other great forest system on Earth is the great boreal forests across Canada and Asia, Siberia. They're burning now in ways that it's almost impossible to imagine. Canada last summer had a burn fire season that was 3 or 4 times greater than any they'd ever experienced. And you begin to sense the kind of just danger of this when you realize that those fires in Canada last year produced about 4 times as much carbon in the atmosphere as all the heating and driving and flying and cooling and cooking and everything else that Canadians did last year. That's what a feedback loop looks like, you know, as this thing starts to accelerate. I think it's safe to say that on land, the place where we see this most acutely now is in the disruptions of the hydrological cycle on this planet, the way that water moves around the Earth. If you wanted one fact to understand our century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold, okay? That means that in arid areas, we get more evaporation and hence more drought. And when that drought combines with heat, we almost automatically get fire on the scale that we're now seeing across this planet. Have in your mind tonight people in California where a huge fire amid a record heat wave has, over in the course of the last 5 or 6 hours, grown to the point where it's threatening 35,000 homes, and they're evacuating people left and right. For the 10th or 15th time in California in the last few years. Once that water is up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. The residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is only about 7 days. And when it comes down in deluge, producing flooding of a scale that we've never seen before. I live in the state of Vermont, and we've had our 2 biggest rainstorms ever in the last 2 years, and they've produced flooding on an almost unimaginable scale. Our capital city, Montpelier, is still, basically, I mean, it was submerged last summer, and businesses and things have only barely begun to build their way back out and start to reopen and things. But Montana or Vermont or California remain rich enough that we're to some degree insulated from this kind of damage. We can go and rebuild roads and bridges and things. That's not true in much of the rest of the world, which is where the damage from climate change is already at its most acute. Last summer, after that huge rainstorm in Vermont, when it started drying up in Vermont, I was paying particular attention to rainfall, and in the next week or so, it started to rain in North Africa, and it rained there like it had never rained before. In Libya, they had their biggest rainfall ever, and along one river corridor, it washed out 2 dams, and then the river flowed into a coastal city, and it washed 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in the course of an hour. And something like that happens now regularly around the world. And the particular moral horror of that comes from the fact that in those places, people did nothing to cause the problem that they are now overwhelmed by. All of Africa, entire continent, our biggest continent, produced about 3% of all the greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere, okay? The US has about 3% of the world's population, but we've produced about 25% of all those greenhouse gases. Nobody, not China, is ever going to catch up with us in terms of total amount of this stuff in the air, and it's all still up there. I mean, this stuff that came out the tailpipe of my family's Plymouth Fury in the 1970s when I was getting my learner's permit in the suburbs of Boston is all still up there in the atmosphere trapping heat, okay? So there is not only an extraordinary practical dimension, but an extraordinary moral and justice dimension to the crisis in which we find ourselves. And the scary part of this is that we're still nearer the beginning than the end of this problem, this disaster. We've raised the temperature of the Earth. Well, in the last year or two, we've broken past the 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier that we set as the thing we were going to try not to go past in Paris long ago in 2015. And on our current trajectory, we're going to end up closer to 3 degrees Celsius as the kind of rise in global average temperature. So nigh on to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. If we allow that to happen, then what's currently a disaster that's causing great, great strain will be a crisis so large that we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. It's just too much violent chaos and flux in those numbers. Just to give one example, let's forget for the moment about the effects on agriculture or the effects on public health or, on and on. The UN estimates that trajectory will produce between 1 and 3 billion climate refugees in the course of this century. There's 9 billion people on our planet, so we're talking about some very large fraction of them having to get up and leave their home behind because it's now underwater, because it's now a desert, because you can't grow food there anymore because it burned down. Think about what happened to the politics of this country or of Western Europe when 1 million refugees showed up on our border. Think about what kind of strains it brought out in us, and then multiply that by 1,000 or 3,000 and try to imagine what kind of world one lives in. Our job is to keep that from happening. It's not to stop global warming. It is too late for that. It is to stop it short of the place where it cuts civilizations off at the knees. That is a task that's the most important task that humans have ever had. And the thing that makes it particularly pressing is if we're going to do it, we have to do it fast. If there's one sort of thing you take home tonight for sort of to remind yourself about climate, it's that it is a timed test, which is not something we are used to in our political life. In our political life, we're used to things that just hang around forever. So long as I've been alive, we've been talking about whether or not we should have national health insurance in America. And I think we should, and I think it's a sin that people die and go bankrupt because we don't have it, and we get a little closer, we get Obamacare or whatever, we go back a little. Someday, probably, maybe, we'll end up where every other industrialized country did in guaranteeing health care, and that'll be a good thing when we do it. And the point I'm trying to make is it won't be harder to do because we delayed, okay? People will have suffered in the meantime, but it won't make it harder to do. Climate change isn't like that. Almost uniquely, it's a kind of one-way ratchet. Once we've melted the Arctic, nobody has a plan for how you freeze it back up again, okay? And the time that we have to play with is now extremely limited. The IPCC, with which Steve did his, some of that work those years ago, published a kind of update in 2021 laying out the terms for what we would need to do were we to have any hope of staying anywhere close to those Paris targets that we set. And what they said was that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 5 years and 4 months away, which is not a lot of time for this task. So that's the hard part of this talk, all right? We are in an extremely tough place that's already causing enormous damage and will cause overwhelming levels of disruption unless we can very quickly make huge changes to stop burning coal and gas and oil. That's the bottom line. So, I'm going to take a breath. You can take a breath. Maybe we should have Charlie come and play a song just to, or something, because we're going to move now in a different direction. And we're going to move, I think, legitimately in a, again, not more hopeful, because we're going to talk about, because whatever hope there is in it depends on what we do. But at least I will lay out the case for why it's possible to imagine that we can make significant progress now. And the reason above all is that the engineers, the scientists did their job back in that period of the 1980s and 1990s, offering us a really clear and powerful warning about what was going to happen. In the subsequent decades, it's the engineers, I think, that have really done their job above all. And that job has consisted in reducing constantly and dramatically the price of renewable energy on this planet. Solar panels are only 65 years old. The very first ones were built used on spacecraft in the late 1950s, and they were incredibly expensive, hundreds and hundreds of dollars a watt. Okay, but people have kept hard at work, and in the last 10 years, the price of solar energy and of wind energy and of the batteries to store that energy when the sun goes down or the winds drop, that price has dropped about 90%, right? Sometime about 3 or 4 years ago, we passed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power that way than by burning coal and gas and oil. Even if you didn't charge coal and gas and oil, as we clearly should, for the cost of the damage that they're doing to the world around us. Just on pure, straight economic terms, we now live on a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a remarkable thing, and I think it hasn't fully sunk in yet with us. We still talk about alternative energy as if sun and wind were kind of the Whole Foods of energy, Do you guys have Whole Foods out here? The kind of expensive boutique, organic kind. It's not. Sun and wind are the Costco of energy now, okay? They are the cheap stuff available in bulk. And that is an extraordinary gift. It means that there is no longer a technological or financial obstacle to making very rapid progress. And we can see this starting to happen in places around the world that have taken it seriously. There are enough of them now that we have some big pilot projects. Probably the best of those pilot projects is a place you may have heard of called California. California has done a lot of work over the last 6 or 7 years to build out its solar and wind resource and to put batteries on its grid. And for a while, that was kind of invisible as it was kind of ramping up. It was those things, it was going up 20% a year, but it was starting from a low base. In the last year, we finally reached that point in the S-curve where it becomes extremely obvious what's going on. I was writing about this for the New Yorker earlier this summer. For the last 100 days, California every day has, for many hours in the course of the day, produced more than 100% of the electricity that it uses from renewable energy, okay? That's a remarkable thing. We're talking about the 5th largest economy on planet Earth and arguably the most modern, okay? At night, when the sun goes down, because those batteries are storing up all that energy, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California is now those batteries, which weren't even on that grid 3 or 4 years ago. This change is rapid and remarkable, and here's the really important number, because it only matters if this is displacing fossil fuel. It doesn't matter if it's just providing more energy. In the last year, California has used 29% less natural gas to make electricity than they did in 2023. 29% in 1 year in an enormous economy is the kind of number that allows you to begin to imagine change at the scale and pace that we need to have some hope of starting to catch up with climate change. In fact, I think you can say it more beautifully than this, and it's the thing that really animates me at the moment. I think it's quite possible that we're at the moment when humans could make the next sort of amazing leap in our, in our kind of civilizational evolution. For 700,000 years, as far back as we have any records of human beings, the most faintest record, all that time humans have been setting things on fire. Darwin said that language and fire were the 2 things that marked human beings. And it was good for us, We learned to cook food, and that allowed us to get the big brain. We were able to move north and south from the equator. No one was going to live in Billings prior to fire, okay? The anthropologists even think that those millennia of standing around the campfire contributed to the sort of strong social bonds that mark our species. It was a kind of proto-Zoom, And then when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil in the Industrial Revolution, it produced modernity. It produced everything around us that we understand as modernity. But the cost of that is now suddenly too high. Not only the overwhelming existential dilemma that is climate change, but there's also the not inconsiderable fact that 9 million people a year on this planet die. That's 1 death in 5 from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, those particulates that lodge in your lungs. If you've been to Delhi or Shanghai in recent years, that won't completely surprise you. But it's here too. There are hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma in America every year that come from breathing particulates. And we know who gets to live next to the highway and next to the refinery and whatever. It's another dimension of the justice issue here. And the point is, it's no longer necessary. We don't need to set things on fire anymore. the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away, and now we have the wit to make use of it. We capture its rays on those panels. We take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that can turn those turbines. We could move past combustion into a different world, and a world that began to work by different rules, because one of the beautiful things about sun and wind is that they are available everywhere. They're not concentrated in a few places where you end up with the extraordinary distortions in power and wealth that come from at the moment, the people in places that sit on top of the fossil fuel that currently dominates our economies. It's a different possibility for a world. It's not a perfect world by any means. You still have to go mine stuff, lithium and cobalt and copper and whatever. But that mining, which we hopefully are alert enough to be figuring out how to do in more environmentally sensitive and humane ways, is a shadow of the scale of the mining that we have to do now. And if you think about it for a minute, you realize why. If you go mine some lithium to make yourself a battery, the battery lasts 25 years, and then you can recycle the lithium. As Montanans know, if you go mine some coal, you set it on fire, and then you have to mine some more coal the next day, okay? Ad infinitum. A way to think about this is that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is just carrying coal and gas and oil back and forth across the oceans to be burnt. None of which we need to do because the sun is happy to deliver that energy every day for free everywhere. So, we've got the biggest problem that humans have ever wandered into, and we have a very large-scale and entirely plausible solution to it at hand, which we've begun to demonstrate in a few places. Really, the most interesting question is why we're not spending absolutely every bit of political and psychic energy that we have as a species rolling this out across the earth just as fast as we ever could. Why we're not taking these last years in which we have still some freedom of movement here and using them to try and make this dramatic shift. And that's, to me, the hardest part of this story, because I think the answer is entirely obvious. I mean, the reason that we're not doing it is because there are serious players on this planet who do not want us to do it. And those are the people who own coal mines and gas wells and oil fields, whose possessions will be far less valuable than they now are if we make this transition. For 30 years, they've been hard at work in climate denial. Back when Steve was doing that work and I was doing that work in the 1980s, we now know from great investigative reporting that the big oil companies were doing exactly the same kind of work, and truthfully, they had more resources and more scientists to do it with than anybody else. Exxon back then was the biggest company on planet Earth. It had a huge team of talented scientists. Carbon was their product, so of course they were going to figure it out, and they did. And we now know from whistleblowers and from archives and things that their scientists told their executives with extraordinary accuracy what the temperature was going to be in 2020 and what it was going to mean. And not only that, their executives completely believed all their scientists who they were paying to get this information from. In the 1980s, Exxon began building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the fact that they knew the sea level was going to be rising. They started plotting out which corners of the Arctic they were going to lease to drill more oil once they'd melted it. Okay? The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, across this industry, they spent billions of dollars building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 30 years in a completely pointless debate about whether or not global warming was real, a debate that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie, and it became the most consequential lie in our history because it cost us the thing we most dearly needed, which was time. That's why we have 5 years, not 35 years, to make this transition, okay? And it's why we may not make it in time. Now, outright climate denial is getting pretty hard, though I will note that one of our presidential candidates is doing his best to keep this tradition alive. But what they're now engaged in might be more plausibly described as solutions denial, an effort to say that we're not ready yet, that this transition should take a long time, that we should go slowly, that we should space it out, on and on and on, which is exactly the wrong message. And it's why, over the last 30 years, we've had to do more than just do science. We've had to organize to try and match that power of the fossil fuel industry. As you can tell, I'm not a born organizer. You know, oratory is not my gift. You know, I'm a writer. That's what I enjoy. I'm glad to be here with you, but really I'd just as soon be, home in my room typing. That's what I like to do, okay? But at some point about 20 years ago, it dawned on me, later than it should have, that writing another book about this was not going to move the needle. Because academics and scientists and professors and things, we tend to think that the key thing is to win the argument, okay? But it turns out that you can win the argument overwhelmingly, and by the mid-1990s, the science on this was crystal clear. You can win the argument overwhelmingly and still lose the fight, because the fight turns out not to be about data and reason and evidence. What fights are always about, money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had enough money and power, and Montanans probably have a fairly front row seat sometimes as to the power of the fossil fuel industry, that they could lose the argument and just keep their business model steaming right along, okay? Which is why we decided we were going to have to build power of our own, and it wasn't going to come from having billions of dollars, because we didn't. The only other recipe is for history would indicate that sometimes if you can get enough people engaged in something, then you can begin to mobilize some power too. So that's what we started trying to do, and we had really no idea what we were doing. I started 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, which takes its very strange name from the most carbon scientists tell us we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number we're already well north of. I started that going on 20 years ago now with myself and 7 college students. We had no money, we had no idea what we were doing, but there were 7 of them, and there are 7 continents, so each one of the students took one. And we started mobilizing. The guy who took the Antarctic also was responsible for the internet, and within a year or two, we had our first big global day of action in 2009, where we had 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries, including some beautiful things in Montana. And that was sort of the coming out party for this movement, which has since grown and grown and grown. I want to just say one thing about it to sort of set up where I'm going to end. The thing that's been beautiful about it is watching the role that young people have played in this fight. So for instance, one of the things I helped start was this big divestment campaign to get institutions to sell their stock in coal and gas and oil. And we've got lots of big pension funds and church funds and things. But most of the action took place on college campuses around the world. And thousands of them divested. We're now at $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested. It's the biggest corporate campaign like it ever. But its biggest, most useful product was probably the kids who cut their teeth doing this and then emerged after they graduating wanting to keep up the fight, and they formed this thing called the Sunrise Movement, and that brought us the Green New Deal idea. And that Green New Deal idea, once it had been run through the congressional sausage-making machinery, brought us finally the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which is a very strange name for what is in essence a climate bill that's finally putting serious amounts of money to work building solar panels and batteries and on and on and on. Those kids were amazing, and it wouldn't have happened without them. And you all know and have watched Greta Thunberg and the very young people that she started organizing 5 or 6 years ago. She's one of my favorite people in the world. I got to write her a letter last summer, congratulating her on her graduation from high school. I mean, think about that for a moment. It's fantastic and appropriate because I'm going to be dead before the very worst of this hits, but if you're in high school or college or in your 20s, now you're going to be in the absolute prime of your life when the very worst of it is happening. And if we don't get it under control, your job will be disaster response, because that's what everyone's job will be, okay? So it's entirely appropriate. But I did hear a few too many people my age say, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem. Okay? And if they really wanted to rub salt in the wound, sometimes they would look at a young person and say, you give me hope. This is profoundly unfair. It's not okay to take the biggest problem the world has ever faced and assign it to people to sort of do once they're done field hockey practice, you know? It's not only unfair, it's also impractical, because remember, this is a timed test. And there is not time for those kids to grow up and become CEOs and senators and whatever else. At the moment, young people by themselves lack the structural power necessary to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. Which is why a couple of years ago, I sort of looking around for where we might find that structural power, I kind of took it upon myself to start organizing people like me, i.e. old people, okay? There are 70 million of us over the age of 60 in this country. I note that there are 2 or 3 scattered around this auditorium tonight. The rest of you can report to your grandparents about this discussion. 70 million of us, and we punch way above our weight politically because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And we ended up with most of the country's financial resources. Fair or not, we've got about 70% of the assets. So if you wanted to put some pressure on Helena or on Washington or on Wall Street, then it helps to have some people with hairlines like mine engaged in this work. So we started this thing called Third Act 2 years ago, and it's just grown like Topsy ever since. We work on climate and on democracy. And we've got now about 80,000 volunteers around the country, and they're doing all kinds of things. They're deeply involved in working on this election. At last count, they're producing about 200,000 postcards a week going into the swing states. People are getting on buses to go knock on doors, on and on and on. I'm very proud of that. But they're also engaged in the climate fight very, very directly, too. One of the things we've taken on is going after the big banks Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. And we've been trying to make the case that that has got to stop. We had a big day last spring where we had simultaneous demonstrations in 100 cities across the country, and we sat in outside those banks. But because we're older, the prospect of sprawling on the sidewalk for 4 or 5 hours at a time is somewhat less appealing than it might once have been. So we went to in all these places, we went to the Goodwill stores and we got all the rocking chairs that they had and closed down the banks with people in rocking chairs, out front. The Times called it the Rocking Chair Rebellion. So the best part of it, in a way, is that it's demonstrating, I think, to young people that they haven't been completely abandoned in this fight, that elders are actually working in some of the ways you need elders to work in a working civilization. I don't mean necessarily getting arrested. That's not for everyone, and it's not the main work, but I do mean figuring out how to go outside your comfort zone in a serious way, because our planet is way outside its comfort zone. And I mean, that's what it means when the poles begin to melt. I remember one of the very first demonstrations we did was because these young people asked us to they were interested in these banks and said, will you come help us? We wouldn't even have checking accounts, can you come and help? So we said, sure. And I remember going to first of these demonstrations we did, and there were 300 or 400 high school kids there because they understand what they are staring down the barrel of, okay? And they're somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back, there was a big bunch of us from this nascent third act group with a big banner that just said, "Fossils against fossil fuels," okay? And it's, in that spirit that we've continued to try and do some of this work. The point I'm trying to make is the economics of renewable energy are a big help now. We have some, the wind, as it were, is at our backs a little bit. But it's not going to matter if we're not able to make it happen faster than sheer economics alone would produce. We don't have 30, 40 years from now, we're going to run this planet on sun and wind because it's all but free. But if it takes us 30 or 40 years to get there, the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. So our job is to force the spring, as it were, to catalyze this reaction, to make it happen much, much faster. And that does require people engaged in this political fight. I wish it didn't. Every time I've gotten carted off in handcuffs, part of me has just thought, how stupid is this that I'm, have been arrested in order to make our leaders pay some attention to physics. It shouldn't be this hard. But it is hard because there are big questions of money and power at stake, and realistically it takes big movements to try and make that change. So one of the things I would say as you go through Climate Week and think about all this is just to keep reminding yourselves that at every level and in every way, these are questions in part about political power, and that political power is something that we are capable of producing. That the political will that's necessary is something that we can summon, muster, and organize. And I think the way I would say it as I finish is just this. Americans, by default, are highly individualistic. And that's just part of who we are. And there's good things and bad things that go with it, but that's, defines us probably more than any other culture on earth. And that means that even when we're good-heartedly taking on important things, we tend to think about them in very individualistic terms. So when you think about climate change, the question becomes, what's on my roof, what's in my garage, so on. That's good. I'm glad that I have solar panels all over my roof, and I'm glad they connect to the EV in my garage. But we are past the point where we are solving this thing 1 Tesla at a time, okay? The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual. Join together with others in movements large enough to make change happen. Now, and that's why we build 350.org or Third Act or the Citizens Climate Lobby or on and on and on. I'm not going to tell you, because I don't know, that we will win even if we do this. We have set very large physical forces in motion now, and we do not understand precisely how they're going to play out. And it's not inconceivable that we've waited too long at some level and tipped some things. But the best science indicates we may still have a narrow and rapidly closing window in which to do some things. And it's that time thing that just haunts me. My great hero is Dr. King, and Dr. King would say at the end of talks, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Translated means, this may take a while, but we're going to win, which is a very comforting thought, and one that the very brave people from the civil rights movement very much needed to be able to hear and believe. But it's not a message that works for us in this context, because the arc of the physical universe turns out to be short and to bend towards heat, okay? If we don't solve it quick, we don't solve it. So that's the bad news, but the good news is, and I say this to you because obviously everybody here has some real desire to be at work on this. Just know that you have many, many, many brothers and sisters all over the world who are meeting in these same ways and thinking through these same things and trying to figure out how to solve this problem in time. It's occurred to me, and I realize I've been talking about the very long scope of history tonight, back 700,000 years or 125,000 years or things. It occurs to me on occasion that that climate change is sort of a test of whether the big brain was a useful adaptation or not, okay? It clearly can get us in a lot of trouble, and maybe it can get us out. My intuition, my hunch, is that really what's important is the size of the heart that's connected to that brain. And that's what we're going to find out. We'll find out on November 5th. We'll find out in the next 5 years. We'll find out, everybody in this room will live long enough to see what the answer to this is. And my hope is just that you will be a big part of what that answer is. Thank you all very much. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for giving us that inspiration, and I hope we can take that and do it. But we still have about a half hour, and we want to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask that people who have questions would try and stand up and come down to the microphone right here and use the microphone to ask the question. So, does anybody have any questions?
And, comments or critique or abuse as well. I laid it on pretty heavily on all of you, so you feel free to return the favor if you would like.
All right, you got one person coming. Good. Somebody else coming. Good. Stand and wait for your turn.
Hi, thank you for coming to Montana and welcome to our beautiful state. So one of the things that I work on in the community is homicide and missing person stuff. So one of my questions is, how do you see climate change impacting crime rates?
So that's a really interesting question. How does climate change interact with crime rates? And And it's actually a question that we have an increasing amount of data on. And it probably won't surprise you to find out that the data pretty clearly indicates that as you build a hotter planet, in heat waves, we can demonstrate that crime, aggression, violence increase. There's just a new study showing the UN showing a really quite marked increase in domestic violence during, and if you think about it, it's not too surprising. I mean, think about how you feel when it gets really hot and really humid, and you get stressed. You get, your trigger gets, shorter, and it's one of the examples of the degree to which everything around us depends on. I mean, the climate is the single most important variable in the world around us. But we don't, since it's always been the same through the last 10,000 years, it's always been the kind of backdrop. And now it's becoming the foreground, and we can really notice its effect on just that kind of thing. So it's a very good question. And it's, one of the things to remember about all this too, is that as the temperature goes up, and the temperature is really going up, especially in equatorial parts of the world where heat waves are just becoming unbearable. I mean, we're talking week after week of heat indexes and feels like temperatures and things in the 120s across huge cities. Delhi had this year's second biggest city in the world, had weeks of just the straight thermometer temperature was near 120 degrees. All you do in those temperatures is try to survive to the next day, You're not doing anything else. You're not out, advancing yourself or developing your community or building your business or whatever else. You're just trying to hang on. And that's going to be more and more and more of the world in the years ahead unless we can blunt that. So that's a powerful question.
So does that mean that we're going to have more hotheads to deal with?
There you go.
Doesn't sound good to me. Carol.
Yeah, I was a petroleum geology, coal geologist through the early 90s and 80s. And I found out that my science and my knowledge and my ability to look at the situation didn't matter. I told them, you're wasting the energy, you're wasting the commodity, you're wasting our people's money. And I was paid back by getting fired. And I decided for my own conscience, I had to live my life. And so from that time on, I pretty much did what you did. I don't have the clout and I don't have as much about that. But one of the things I have also found out in going out and looking at the environment, seeing what was happening to the environment and what was going around, is what I've also saw about what was happening to the animals in creation, how they were being affected, and then finding out that when they were left alone and when they got to go back into areas where we had devastated and we left it, how they reclaimed it. So the other side of the coin is this: when you're doing all this, be sure you watch and try to understand what is happening with the animal population, because they have their little hearts, minds, and souls on the pulse of how to turn this around.
Amen. You'll be interested, Carol, in a piece that I published yesterday, I guess, on the New Yorker website, and it was really the most fun thing I'd done in quite a while. I spent a few days with friends of mine in Vermont, whose thing is working with people building solar farms to plant pollinator-friendly native plants in between the rows in large quantities. And it was completely, I mean, it was beautiful, and it also kind of eye-opening in ways that I hadn't quite anticipated. So here's what they found. It turns out that there's as with every field in the world, because we're very good at these things, there's a standard protocol for how you count how many pollinators there are and you pick a strip and you walk up and down it for 7.5 minutes and you count how many pollinators you see, how many little sweat bees and wasps and moths and things that you can count. So these guys were taking over fields that were mostly abandoned, recently abandoned cornfields, and they'd been, monoculture, and they'd been sprayed and things for years. So, maybe they'd been sitting there for a year fallow, and when they did this count, they'd find about 40 pollinators in that 7.5 minutes. Well, then they went in and put in a solar field, and they planted all these plants. And 2 years later, you'd walk down the same thing and you'd find 300 or so of these pollinators in your 7-minute stretch. The thing that really opened my eyes that I hadn't really thought about was I said, well, what if you just go to this cornfield over here that's still being actively managed to grow corn and sprayed with pesticides? How many pollinators will you find there? And the entomologist that I was with said, oh, you'll find 0. That's the point, And it's a sort of reminder that the way that we look at, we're sort of used to sort of looking at, say, a cornfield and thinking that's nature, it's green, okay? But in fact, viewed another way, a kind of modern cornfield is just a collection of inefficient solar collectors on which you have to pour a lot of nitrogen to make them work at all, and the nitrogen then washes into the river, and then you've got a whole other problem. It was really beautiful and fascinating to see all these rare native insects emerging some of which people hadn't seen for decades in Vermont, coming into these, and to sort of be in this field that was solving 2 of the great crises that we face right now, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis at the same time, and doing it in a way that was quite paradoxical to our sense that there's something industrial and ugly about putting these solar panels there. So it was I like things that kind of twist my conception a little bit. And I'll add one thing about this just to give you a sense of the scale of solar power. I was in Illinois earlier this summer doing a piece, and because there's a lot of cornfields there, almost all of which are used for growing corn that we turn into gasoline, ethanol. And the numbers were amazing. The guy I was with had one of these Ford F-150 Lightnings, the electric version of the most popular vehicle in America. And so we were talking about that. He said, well, if you take an acre of corn and you turn it into ethanol, that produces enough ethanol to drive a regular Ford F-150 about 25,000 miles. So that's, something. But he said, if you take that same acre and you cover it with solar panels, and then take the electricity and put it into this electric Ford F-150, same truck, same size, you get about 550,000 miles from it, about 20 times as much. It's a kind of reminder that photosynthesis, though a remarkably beautiful trick, is pretty inefficient, too, compared to a solar panel. That we're playing now with really interesting forces. So we're not going to have to cover, it would take less of America than is currently growing corn for ethanol to produce all the electricity that we need to power the entire country. We're not talking about paving America in solar panels. We're talking about taking some portion of it to grow the crop that we most need right now, which is clean electrons.
Bill, I want to interject that in the area, we have a big canal that goes through the Billings, and between Central and Broadwater, there's a kind of a park along it. There's a lot of prairie dogs there. The city, I don't know, I've been telling the city about this park, and they've been cutting the grass way down every spring and all off this, and it would burn. We had a fire on it, and the trees, they were having to replace the trees and everything. Well, this last year, they didn't do that. And I found out when I looked into the prairie dogs, their engineering transfers the water through whatever water that they did use. They didn't have to use it this much, have to water it this much. And the trees are growing. They didn't have any trees dying. We didn't have any fires on the grass. And
There you go. You got to hire some prairie dogs and some beavers, and
yeah, they're good engineers, and you need to watch them because they know what they're doing.
No
and so there's
question.
other animals too. Just keep an eye on them. They're cute too.
Thank you, Carol.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Ed?
Thanks again for coming. I was just amazing eloquence of just speaking from without any notes or anything. So I really enjoyed it. I guess I know you don't have time or to go through all the different potential solutions out there. You were focusing on the solar and the renewables, right? But I guess maybe just a pitch for. We have a very energy-intensive lifestyle here in this country, and the economics of driving that very quick transition that we know we need to be doing. I think we should also be thinking about efficiency, or also in our buildings, but in terms of a more walkable communities, things that we, not just
Amen.
us all driving EVs is not going to.
Amen.
We're not going to drive our way to paradise.
Amen. So two things to say about that, and it's a very good point. Two things I would say. One is I've come to have a kind of fairly brute realism over the years in the sort of course of doing this. Not because it's my sense of the world is, I wrote a book once called Deep Economy that was sort of on this theme, that 100 years from now, humans are not going to be living the ways that we're living now, because above all, I think it turns out that the kind of high consumption lifestyles that we've built don't make us as happy as they say as we want them to. I think we will get over that. I think it's a phase, okay? But I also don't think that it's a phase that we're going to get over fast enough to deal with the immediate crisis that we're in. Like 5 years is not a period of time in which we're going to see cultural shifts large enough in that way to matter, which is why why I do think we're going to have a period of electric vehicles and so on and so forth. But I do think that and I also think that as we're doing this, we should always keep that goal in mind of sort of where we're headed. There's a beautiful thing about solar and wind power is that to some degree they begin the task of relocalizing economies because they're available everywhere, to one degree or another. So that's good. And they also hold that. There's a lot of things that are happening right now that are on one hand technological, but on the other hand, very much in service of a different kind of community. And the best example for me is not the electric vehicle, it's the electric bicycle. And that's the thing. I think that may turn out to be a more transformative technology. They're selling far more of them around the world, especially in Asia, than EVs. And if you think about it, I mean, it is a kind of magic. I mean, I love to bike. I've biked all my life. But the problem with biking is, of course, hills. And an e-bike is just a machine to make a hills disappear. That's their point, okay? And hence they open up this, I mean, it's truly revolutionary in a way an EV isn't. It's just a kind of better version of what we're doing at the moment. And so cities that you can walk and bike and those are incredibly attractive, rural communities that begin to replace the kind of current sprawl with more interesting settlement patterns. That's all incredibly interesting and hopeful. It's just going to take a little while to get there, and that part I mean, the physics of climate change is not negotiable in terms of its time. So we're going to have to, I think we're going to have to do some of both the way through, but it's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think with housing affordability is such a huge issue, and I think everyone feeling like they have to have a car in order to have a job it means that the affordability for housing, owning one less car per household.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the best things that's happened in the last 4 years in Washington is that the federal housing, the FHA, has begun saying that housing built with federal funds, which somewhere or another turns out to be a large percentage of the housing that gets built, needs to be energy efficient and increasingly needs to be clustered and all those kind of things. I think we're going to see this YIMBY, yes in my backyard kind of movement that's gathering steam is really beginning to, and I was quite amazed and gratified to see Kamala Harris call it out by name in her address at the convention the other day, sort of talk about yes in my backyard in a building. It's
Okay.
I'll just say, as you can tell from listening to me, I'm not by nature a Pollyanna of any kind. I mean, the book I wrote about all of this 35 years ago was called The End of Nature, okay? So but I do think I feel more legitimately excited by the possibilities, not by any means the probabilities or the guarantees, but by the possibilities of the world now than I have for a very long time.
That's good. Interesting. Okay, next.
Hey, Bill. Steve Held. I'm so impressed we got you here. It's just amazing. I want to thank Tom, too, and Steve running. You guys are just terrific in all the work you've done. So I'm the father of the young woman they call the Greta of the Rockies. But Ricky Held. And I loved your article, the one you just mentioned. There was a quote in there, be the change, B-E-E, the change, and we're putting in solar. So as you mentioned, we're all a group of people of a certain age. What are you going to do as a point of example for the rest of your life that we might look to with these years we have left?
Well, I'm just going to keep, at least for the time being, I'm going to keep on organizing. I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface of this work we can do at Third Act with older people. And now people around the world are wanting to join in and build it out and that kind of thing. I think it's been a vastly underutilized part of our, we have a very, we have a youth-oriented culture on the one hand, and then we've had this culture where we've kind of just assumed that when you got older you weren't my least favorite bumper sticker that I've ever seen, and I used to see it a lot on back of Winnebagos and things, is that bumper sticker that said, "I'm spending my kid's inheritance," okay, which was both true and cynical to a degree that it was almost believable. It turns out that most the people don't want that. We've found extraordinarily how much people want, for different reasons. Young people want to take on these questions because they're going to have to live with them. But when you get nearer the exit than the entrance, you begin also sort of just sort of naturally imagining the kind of legacy, the kind of world that lives on behind you. And so I'm going to keep doing that kind of work in the service of this kind of change. And I'm not I won't do it past the point where it makes sense. I've talked with my wife, told my wife, that it's possible that the day will come when it just becomes clear that we've kind of lost this climate fight and the forces, we didn't get control of the big physical. And if that happens, I'm going to sit on my porch and drink whiskey and play with my grandson, but not there yet, There's enormous things to do. This is going to be the most interesting next stretch that we've ever had. And the fact that we don't know how it's going to come out is one of the things that makes it so interesting, you know?
Thank you for your service.
Back at you, and please thank your daughter and all those other kids from that court case. It was really fun to get to write about that a little bit, and I got to say it was one of the great moments in the history of the climate fight when the state of Montana paid $40,000 to the climate denial expert from wherever she was, and then she just decided not even to come out and testify because it was clear she was going to get her hat handed to her. So that's it. That's it. So
Next.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That was a wonderful talk. I'm one of the fossils in the audience that you mentioned. I still refer to the book, The Age of Missing Information, that you had written a number of years ago. I really love that book, and I still refer to that book periodically. One of the things that an organization that I belong to in Montana is working on right now is a narrative shift and trying to change the narrative over alternative fuels and trying to, by doing that, get more of the public to be more actively involved in that process. So I'm just kind of wondering what kind of language, what kind of ideas you have in terms of, because I would imagine that narrative shift is something that is happening all across the country, or the world, or whatever. What kind of a language you find that might be useful in trying to create that narrative shift?
it's a very good question, and it's of course different from place to place, and you know, but I find for my own self and for more and more people that I talk to, that this idea that we could basically end combustion on this planet is a very powerful idea. You know, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, and I find the idea, if you go back and read, you know, the first page of the good book, and I think it's one of those books that more people read the first page of than the rest often. You know, right at the beginning, God's creating the sun there, you know, to light the world. And if you go and look at pretty much any religious tradition, if you go far enough back, not surprising that we're sort of that we're deeply connected to the sun. And so I think that there's enormous power in this idea that the sun, which already gives us light and warmth and photosynthesis, is now happily willing to provide all the power that we need to make our lives work. I think that there's great power in that. We're going to try and do next year a sort of global day of action. We're going to tentatively calling it Sun Day, to just sort of try and make this point around the world. And I think that part of the narrative shift, and I've been sort of getting at this obliquely, is a tone shift. We've maxed out the number of people that we can attract. I was talking with Greg earlier about this, that anger and fear and guilt and sadness have we've probably reached as many people as we can with that set of emotions. They're entirely appropriate. You can tell that I'm angry, that I'm sad, that I feel guilty, and that I'm afraid of those are all, and those have a role and a place to play, and they've powered this movement to a very large degree. But we also need some romance and joy and adventure in this work too. The last time that we had and we're running long here, so this might be the place to end. The last time that we had a project in this country, a technological project of, you know, that kind of was like anything like this, was the moonshot in the 60s, you know, which was remarkably interesting, but it was about putting two guys on a different planet. Now the job is to bring a different planet down to this one and allow it to kind of unleash the deep beauty of this place, protect and preserve it. And not only is it a great project in that same way, I think it also manages to supply the thing that I feel most deeply, and I think a lot of other people feel to some degree or another, which is a deep hope for some kind of unifying project in our society. The level of division in our society, in our country, and in our world is profound now. And one of the reasons, I think, is that we don't have a kind of project that we're at work on together. And, you know, the sun, we all live under the same sun. It's not a you know, sentimental cliche. It's just a statement of absolute fact. It is the most, the sun's very interesting. It's the most fundamental fact of our world, and yet it's the one object on the planet that we can't actually look at directly, you know? It's sort of, and I don't know, I can't remember, I don't know if you guys were in the path of, but that when the eclipse came through last year, it came through our part of the world in Vermont. And it was the greatest moment of the year. People were just so happy. Everybody, everything shut down. Everybody out looking at it. I was out at the college near me, Middlebury, and there were 1,500 students out in the quad, and they put their phones down for a full 20 minutes, you know, as this was happening. So for me, that's the narrative shift that that's the story right now that's most compelling to me, that this most primal force on our planet, which has been kind of disregarded except when it's doing something weird like eclipsing, you know, comes back into focus as the kind of emblem of the future that we're building. Who knows? Good luck. It's an important project, thinking about narratives. Thank you all enormously. Tom, thank you so much.
All right. I guess we have one more real quick.
Sorry. Hey, thank you guys so much. A question for both of you, perhaps. Last night kicked off Billings Climate Week with Crystal Two Bowls, and it blew my mind open with other parts of this conversation that I personally haven't been having. So I was wondering if you could touch on real briefly before we end on the land back movement and how you might be connected with that. Thank you very much.
Sure, I'll just talk about it briefly. You know, I was in Santa Fe yesterday, and the best part of that visit was getting to talk to 700 kids at the Santa Fe Indian School. It's the sort of boarding school in Santa Fe for kids from all the pueblos across New Mexico. No, it was great. And one of the reasons that it was so much fun for me was that I got to tell them stories about a huge percentage of my closest colleagues in this activist work for the last 20 years have been indigenous people in the US, in Canada, in the South Pacific, in South America, on and on and on. And one of the things that, and this connects to this question around narrative and things, one of the things that's most interesting right now is that the oldest wisdom traditions in the planet and the newest wisdom traditions in the planet are converging in powerful ways. You know, sort of the message from the sweat lodge and the message from the satellite and the supercomputer are remarkably congruent, and in part sort of around this question of we really can't just keep growing our economy forever and taking up ever more space and it's not working, and to back off. I think that's a very powerful moment. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's been such a productive, powerful leadership from indigenous communities in the climate movement all over the place. And to go to what we were just talking about, well, in our tradition, in our continent anyway, it's very clear who's done the most thinking about the sun as you know, a kind of central focus of thought and activity. And so I think that it's going to be very fruitful stuff going forward. That's one of the things that gives me a certain amount of hope for where we are. The indigenous part of the climate movement has been some of the most interesting, most beautiful, most powerful parts of the whole thing. And so it's really been, it really was just for me a great pleasure just to sit and talk with these 700 young people and just say, here are people you should know about, real heroes coming out of your communities who are saving not just your communities, but at the forefront of trying to figure out how we save the whole shooting match, you know, so.
We are out of town.
All right.
Time.
Thank you all so
I
much.
think we better quit. Thank you so much, Bill McKibben. Thank you for this evening. That's correct. Community 7 has streamed this, and they're also recording it, and you can go to Community 7 and click on the right click and listen to the whole thing. We are supposed to get out of here as soon as we can. I need to ask you if you can quickly move out.